Emerging Threats and Solutions, brought to you by Acronis and US Signal. Today, our cybersecurity experts will highlight the latest risks associated with Microsoft 365 and delve into the world of cyber threats and their potential impact on your organization. Our experts will begin by providing an overview of Microsoft's responsibility versus your responsibility. We will also go into types of Microsoft 365 attacks, how to protect your data with US Signal and Acronis, and then we'll open the floor for some Q&A. Before we begin, I would like to introduce you to today's expert panelists, Steve Brining, Cybersecurity Evangelist, Cyber Protect at Acronis, who's based out of Tempe, Arizona, and Nick Defoe, Director of Information Security at US Signal, based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I'm your moderator, Katie McCormick, Director of Marketing at US Signal. US Signal is a provider of industry-leading data center technologies, cloud solutions, and managed services to help companies transform their IT operations and meet the ever-changing technology and business needs. Drawing from a portfolio of colocation, IT infrastructure, endpoint monitoring, data management, disaster recovery, and security services, US Signal's data center solutions can meet even the most unique or complex technical requirements. All services are powered by US Signal's own robust, secure fiber network and backed by 24/7, 365 local expert support. US Signal's backup as a service powered by Acronis provides deep agent capability, offsite storage, easy to use management portal, and simple recovery options. Choose fully managed backup as a service to leverage the experts in US Signal's Technical Operations Center and Security Operations Center, or select the manage it yourself data backup option. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve at Acronis to get us started.
I appreciate that. And I know you can hear me, but I'm kind of in a little bit of a remote location. So by putting video on, I probably could destroy my session here. So I apologize, I can't be on screen. So I usually like to get started with like a little factoid. If anybody in the chat window wants to kind of put, other than saying this is the top line of the letters on your computer keyboard, does anyone know what this was related to email? I'm just curious. This is one of those things like if you're ever on Jeopardy and you could take use of I like that, Jared. It's my password. If you had Final Jeopardy, I'll take email fax for 300 Alex type thing. Anyway, so what this was the first email that was sent in 1971 by a gentleman by the name of Ray Tomlinson. So it's the actual first email message that was actually composed and sent from that. So just a little icebreaker there. Next slide, please, Katie. So we're talking about 365 today. We know it's the #1 productivity tool practically out there, and there's a widespread adoption with that. We know that it has a whole bunch of different tools in there, from file share, collaboration, and so forth. And it's transformed the way that we work and communicate, right? Well, when you have growing popularity, you do get consequences like more attacks for cyber threats and more dependency on your data and availability there. I don't normally go over a lot of stats, but I thought it was interesting. Microsoft said that they saw an increase in targeted attacks on 365 because if everybody's playing, in the sandbox, that's the place that you go after. I could tell you that I think it was Mindcast that came up with 60% companies experienced a 365 email outage in the past year as well. So there's a clear need to protect 365 data, right? So let's kind of go through this a little bit. Next slide, please. So now that we're talking about it being a very popular thing for a lot of people and an avenue for attack, it's a very solid first line of attack. is what I'm just trying to say. So it's a very important thing for you to look at. So next slide. As Katie mentioned, part of what we're going to talk about is Microsoft puts a shared responsibility model with their 365. So which tasks are handled by Microsoft and which would be handled by you or US Signal helping you. Again, Microsoft's responsibility here is the infrastructure uptime, service setup and management, data centers, data replication, geo redundancy, which a lot of people often mistake that for backup, access control, authentication, and physical security of the data centers. What's responsible for you? Well, data security and protection, your endpoint management, right? Access management, account management, and even handling regulatory compliancy for that, right? And we're going to see here very shortly what Microsoft says about this and why you should be partnering with US Signal. So next slide. If you just wanted me to kind of circle the areas for you, this is pretty much the standard of what they do. So if we go to the next slide, everyone knows this, right? Or they don't, is what I'm trying to say. This is section 6B of their services agreement. And really what they're saying here is you can't rely on us to basically back up your data. And we really recommend using third-party apps and services like what what US Signal is actually helping provide to you today. So just know that this is actually coming from Microsoft, telling you where you need to use third-party apps for this. Next slide, Katie. On top of that, research firm, enterprise strategy group out there pretty much said the same thing. So just trying to let you know that it's not just Microsoft, but a lot of other research groups says it. Next slide. So we could talk about risks here. A lot of times, we always talk about ransomware and phishing attacks, but really accidental deletion seems to be a lot. I'm starting to see, as an evangelist and talking globally with a lot of companies, a lot of internal threats is really happening a lot out there. Of course, like with compliancy, as it said in my bio there, I am a commanding officer in the Arizona Army National Guard here. We have to hold on to certain pieces of data for quite a few number of years. Well, Microsoft doesn't handle that for us, right? And you'll see why in a few minutes. But again, you're going to have third-party integrations. I've seen a lot of API attacks happen out there, supply chain attacks. But we'll talk about retention policy gaps as well in a minute here. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about Microsoft not being responsible for your backup here, right? So by default, when a user really deletes an email in 365, right, it's moved to a deleted folder. And they could be retained there until either the user manually will empty it, or sometimes it's automatically emptied by retention policies that could be set by administrators. Now, if an item is removed from that deleted folder, right, it's moved to a hidden folder called the recoverable items folder. And that's where it's retained for a default period of 14 days. Now, in full disclosure, it can be configurable by administrator by up to a maximum of 30 days in that situation. So during this period, the user can recover the deleted items without administrator assistance. But if you are looking at holding things for 6 months worth of data, this might be a challenge for you because Microsoft's not really holding on to that information for you. So, you have to think about legal compliancy, like if you were in HIPAA, or I'll say hypothetically, the military, we had to hold on to emails for 7 years. Microsoft doesn't have that information. So this is why it's very important to partner with companies like US Signal to manage these things for you. And you'll understand as we get further into the conversation. So to me, that's just a little bit of a homework ahead of time. And at this point, I wanted to turn it over to Nick, who's going to talk about some specific types of attacks with Microsoft 365. So Nick, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So coming at this, as kind of two mindsets here. So here at US Signal, my role as Director of Information Security, I run our Security Operations Center, which means that we're kind of on the front lines in protecting US Signal and some of our customers that consume our managed security services, against these types of attacks. But even before that, my background before coming to US Signal was as a penetration tester. And so I got to have some fun actually carrying out these types of attacks against different, types of infrastructure and specifically Microsoft 365 a lot of times. So, I've got some background to talk to these specifics here. So, the number one way that attackers do get access to one of your accounts, and we'll start out with the account hijacking, right? Because usually the phishing is what they do to try to accomplish the account hijacking. But account hijacking is the big threat with the Microsoft ecosystem because you basically can't stop somebody from attempting to log into your Microsoft 365 account. Sure, you can have conditional access policies and things like that that may help, but they can still log in and get past like the first hurdle before those conditional access policies may take effect. So generally, a phishing email can come in that would direct you to something like a login screen or potentially a malicious download. And those types of attacks then enable them to take over the account or take the account hijacking to that next step. And as Steve was kind of talking about, Microsoft 365 is such a huge target for these types of account hijacking or account takeovers because not only of the adoption, because so many organizations out there use Microsoft 365 nowadays, but also because of all of the integrations that have been put in place with Microsoft 365 too. So when you gain access to something like a Microsoft 365 account, chances are you're going to gain access to a lot more than just the Microsoft stuff too. So you could gain access to a CRM or a ticketing system or even a VPN using the same set of credentials that you use to get into that Microsoft 365 account. So phishing against Microsoft 365, huge, threat vector there, and enables the account hijacking. Now, malware and ransomware can be another impact of those account takeovers because once you gain access again to that 365 account, you do potentially gain access to something like a VPN, or at least you have the credentials to that account and you could look at ways to reuse them in other places. So Microsoft 365 really is the nexus of all of these things, especially because of that integration between different tooling that Microsoft as the identity provider is enabling in this ecosystem. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the man-in-the-middle attacks is another kind of side tangent of the account takeover process generally. And the reason I say that is because one of the most popular ways to do phishing against Microsoft 365 or ways that it's growing in popularity in doing phishing against Microsoft 365 is using man-in-the-middle techniques. And the reason that's growing in popularity is because of the increased adoption of multi-factor authentication. So if you couple together a phishing attack with a man-in-the-middle attack, you can make it look like when you send that phishing email to a user, you can make the link that you're sending them be a web server you control, but is just proxying the actual Microsoft services behind it. So totally legitimate Microsoft service is what they see, not a Microsoft domain name and URL. So they actually think they're logging into Microsoft 365 and they are logging into Microsoft 365, but with that man in the middle perspective, they're able to take over your sessions with that Microsoft 365 by simply copying down your session cookies and then using that to then gain access to everything that's in your Microsoft 365 tenant. So hand in hand phishing, man in the middle, Microsoft 365 is a huge target for that type of attack specifically right now, due to everybody doing the right thing and adopting multi-factor, which is really fun. attackers are always adapting to the new changes by defenders. Moving on to kind of some of these other topics. So denial of service attacks against Microsoft 365 specifically are somewhat rare, but we have seen them at least in the last few months. And it's kind of interesting because specifically in that case, Exchange Online got taken down by a ideological threat actor that was aligned with Russia, and they attacked Microsoft due to Microsoft aligning with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine in that current conflict, right? So because of this geopolitical clash that's happening on the other side of the world, we all of a sudden can't get access to email when we might need it really badly or whatever to do our jobs here in the United States. So definitely something to have on your radar as a possibility. Though Microsoft is better equipped than most to take on those types of attacks, it is still possible to impact their services that way. And next, the insider threat is always something that can pop up and impact your organization, especially if you talk about the careless users accidentally leaking data type of aspect here. So specifically in the Microsoft ecosystem, there are so many different ways to do things like share files from one user to another, share file from inside your organization to outside of your organization. And if you don't have intimate knowledge of how those things should be configured and how those things should be controlled and how those things should be monitored for abuse, you really have a great potential to have these types of threats crop up, especially when it comes to people just doing things unintentionally that have impact that they aren't aware of, right? That's a real fear that we have at our organization, for example. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So coming back to some of these similar topics that we've talked about before. So another way that that a threat actor can gain access to a account and take an account takeover or account hijacking type of attack to the next step is by using brute force or password spraying attacks. So password spraying, if you haven't heard that term before, is where you use things like either commonly used passwords, which any penetration tester or any threat actor is going to have a list of their top 10 or 20 favorite passwords that are very commonly seen out there that they will try against all of the accounts in your organization until they get lucky. Or they're going to use what's called breach data. So data that was discovered from a data breach impacting another organization that your users might have been affected by, right? So the classic example there is LinkedIn. A long time ago, it's 2015 now, long time ago, LinkedIn had a major data breach where their password database was leaked and as a part of the data. And so you could see that so-and-so from your company was impacted by that data breach. The threat actor can gain access to that database and then try to use that same password that they used at LinkedIn to log into your organization. Well, that first password might not have worked, but they might also do something like then add a 1 or an exclamation point to the end of that password. And all of a sudden, that password that was in the LinkedIn breach is going to work to get into your organization because users like the easy thing. They like to follow patterns, and attackers, threat actors have caught on to that, and they'll do things like slightly modify the password that was in the data breach to try to figure out if that's going to get them into your systems. So spoofing and impersonation, also a very common tactic, especially around the phishing types of scenarios. And also business email compromise as well. So a phishing attack and business email compromise don't necessarily have to be the same thing, but generally they share that spoofing aspect. So if they're going to send a phishing email in, they want you to trust what they're trying to tell you to do. So they might impersonate somebody that you know, or even a business partner that you work with. Same thing if you're talking about business email compromise. You might be used to working with a specific vendor or a specific support agent, something like that. And all of a sudden, they're going to spoof that person because they know that you have a relationship with them. And by seeing something that you're familiar with, you're going to trust what they want and do what they're asking for. And lastly, in this slide, the zero-day exploit. So this is relatively rare for Microsoft 365, or at least they don't like to acknowledge that it's something that's feasible for Microsoft 365. But even just recently, there was this case where all of a sudden there was a threat actor, I believe a Chinese threat actor, that was rooting around in the back end of Azure, and they were using a cryptographic signing key that Microsoft couldn't even tell where they got this signing key from to be able to access all these different resources in the back end of Azure. And it's kind of a big open question mark what actually happened there, how they gained the access that they did, and what they actually did with the access that they had. So zero-day exploits certainly are possible in the Microsoft ecosystem. We know they happen against Exchange on premises quite frequently. So it's only logical to think that they could happen against Microsoft's cloud resources too. But the visibility of you as a customer to Microsoft's cloud resources isn't as good, right? So you don't necessarily know if you've been impacted by these things. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last of the types of attacks, but kind of touched on this before. Data leakage due to misconfigured permissions. Again, the Microsoft ecosystem is very vast and very complex. You've got different things like Power BI, you've got the dynamic CRM that's always kind of there behind the scenes. You've got OneDrive, you've got SharePoint. All of those things have different capabilities to do different kind of functionality, and a bunch of them can share files and a bunch of them can share sensitive data. And you might not even know how your users are using those services inside your business. And so it really does take a lot of vigilance to try to stay on top of that. But even then, the best thing you can really go by is what Microsoft calls their secure score, which is in the security panel for Microsoft to really kind of understand like roughly how well you've got your system hardened. And that's better than nothing, but still it's a very complex situation. We kind of talked about eavesdropping or interception with the man in the middle type of discussion before. Kind of skip over that at this point because I think I beat that to death. And lastly, the supply chain attacks is also something that is a real threat, even in the Microsoft ecosystem, because guess what? In most situations, you don't really buy your Microsoft services directly from Microsoft. You generally buy it through a VAR or something. There's a specific Microsoft name for them, but I don't recall what it is. And I can tell you, I have firsthand experience where that reseller has requested much more permissions into the customer tenant for the organization than they really need. Why do they want to have full enterprise admin in the organization that they're reselling to? I don't know, but it certainly does open up a lot larger of a potential impact if there's some kind of security concern there. And that actually has been seen, that relationship between the reseller and the customer on the Microsoft 365 services has been seen being abused in threat actor activity in the past. So something to not count out as well. So that was a lot, but now talking a little bit more strategically about how do you protect against these threats. Number one thing is education and training. And the security practitioner is always going to talk about that as being an important aspect of what they do in protecting their organization. And it really is something that I strongly believe as well, that your users can either be the greatest weakness for your organization or the best protection for your organization. And it all depends on what state of mind they're in, how much training they've got, and if they feel empowered to do the things to look for kind of the smoking guns, if you will, and some things like those phishing attacks, right? So user education, very important, and providing the proper level of training to get them up to speed as to what kind of threats are out there, what's the latest things that are being attacked, what do those attacks look like, and so on. Multi-factor authentication is critically important. And I did mention before how multi-factor is not a silver bullet anymore in terms of stopping threats, because the threat actors have adapted to combat that by using techniques like the man in the middle. There's a specific tool out there called Evil Jinx, which pen testers and threat actors like to use. And basically, it allows you to transparently intercept credentials, or not credentials, but well, actually credentials and session tokens, and all of a sudden you can take over an account that that falls victim to your phishing through that kind of method. So the other thing with multi-factor is recently there's been a big increase in what are called multi-factor fatigue attacks. And that would be where a threat actor is able to push multiple push notifications to your app on your phone, say like, hey, let me in, let me in, let me in, let me in, with the idea that sooner or later the user is just going to relent or not pay it enough attention, and allow the threat actor to get past that multi-factor check without really thinking about it. Now, the big thing here with multi-factor is that not all multi-factor is created equal. We've got here a specific note that SMS is no longer viewed as a great multi-factor solution. It's still probably better than nothing, but SMS falls down here on the list. Microsoft 365 actually now has this concept built into the conditional access policies of strength of authentication, which is a different metric for how you can grant different levels of access to things depending on the strength of your authentication. So no multi-factor all the way at the bottom, bad, especially if you're using it for admin accounts or things like that. SMS, slightly better, still not great though. There was just a story over the last 3 days about a major organization here in the United States that had a big data breach because one of their users got SIM swapped. So SIM swapping is a way that you can get past multi-factor that's based on SMS. Really, push authentication is a little bit better than SMS based, but still not the best anymore. Really, we need to be looking at the token-based or hardware-based multi-factor to really be secure at this time, because again, those threat actors continue to get better and better. So next topic here, regular audits and monitoring. So monitoring things, and that's another way you can protect against some of those multi-factor threats, is to keep a close eye on where are these push authentications coming from, what quantity are they coming from. And to do that, you really have to have tooling, but tooling can be or can't be part of the Microsoft ecosystem. So Microsoft does have a lot of good security tools that you can get from them, but it's all subject to different licensing levels and so on and so forth. Really though, like to get a great level of protection and monitoring, you have to look at having something like a SIM or an XDR solution. US Signal does have a managed XDR solution that we partner with some of our customers on to protect their environments. And that does pull in data from multi-factor sources like Duo as well as Azure AD. It gives you a really good idea of what's happening in the environment, what is normal in the environment, what is not normal in the environment. And that's kind of like the advanced level of security that, ideally you want to be striving for at this point. Next slide, please. And of course, endpoint protection, something that can't be neglected in any security program at this point. Microsoft themselves offer Microsoft Defender, as everyone's, I'm sure, well aware. And Microsoft Defender has gotten a lot better over the years, but it is very dependent on configuration. You have to have it configured right, and there's a lot of knobs and switches in the Microsoft Defender endpoint kind of controls that allow you to shoot yourself in the foot really easily, unfortunately. So we actually prefer not to use Microsoft for that reason, as well as there's a little bit of watcher watching themselves kind of situation that I feel like there is in place with Microsoft and Microsoft Defender. So we have a solution that we offer customers that's our managed detection and response, which is an endpoint protection based solution or EDR based solution that is built on the SentinelOne platform. So endpoint protection must have nowadays, especially you want something that's like EDR level, not traditional antivirus. Now, Steve's going to talk plenty about data backup here in a minute, so I'm not going to cover that. But last point on this slide is the use of security features. So Microsoft, again, has all kinds of security features baked into the Microsoft 365 platform, and it's hard to wrap your head around all of them, to be honest. But the best thing that you can do is pay some attention to the Microsoft security score, which is in that security portal. And you want to aim to be better than whatever it says the industry standard is for your type of organization. So it does give you this kind of like bar that you can get a little bit of idea of we're here and the industry is here. So we really should be doing some improvement. In a lot of situations, there's some easy, check boxes you can change to level up those settings. But that still doesn't help necessarily figure out all of the ins and outs of the security stack and even what you're licensed for with your licensing package from Microsoft. So next slide, please. Now, patching and updates, not something that I want to talk about in depth, but it is very important to stay on top of this. Microsoft every month on the second Tuesday of the month releases new patches, and some months are more critical than others, but generally you have to keep up. So very important to make sure your organization is keeping up with that, and not just on the Microsoft front. Your firewalls need updating to your network stack, your switches, your third-party software also needs updates. So there's a major vulnerability just recently in WinRAR of all things that could lead to remote code execution and was being taken advantage of by a bunch of threat actors. So always have to stay on top of patching and updates. That's kind of the price of doing IT nowadays. It's pretty much a requirement. Moving on to API interfaces. So many different things to talk about there, but one thing that I will point out is that another threat vector for Microsoft 365 specifically is the OAuth integration capability. So that's one of the APIs that they offer where third-party applications can gain access into your Microsoft tenant using the OAuth protocol to gain access to the calendar or inbox or something like that. And they do have some tooling that's built to help you manage that, but it is one of those tools that's only available at the highest licensing level, again, with Microsoft. And so, you may or may not have that for your organization. You may or may not know you have it. You may or may not have it configured properly to actually use it. But when you have a user that grants themselves access to a third-party application, and then that application has access to all of their email and can send email on their behalf, that's not a good thing. And lastly, least privilege, zero trust, always something to stay on top of as well. You want to make sure that your admin accounts are dedicated admin accounts. They're not used for daily driving, and that your users don't have more privileges than they really need. And again, these things are things that you should just stay on top of with audit and permission review, because your organization's, security kind of depends on it, it's an important thing to pay attention to. So I think that's the last thing for me. So turning it back over to Steve there.
Thanks, Nick. That was very informative. I certainly learned some stuff too, so I appreciate that. All right, so how do we move forward here with how can US Signal help you? One thing about Microsoft 365, there's a lot of being able to recover, but you're going to hear a common theme throughout this is searching and granular restore with third-party backups, and specifically, Acronis here. And I will show you the method that they decided to use with us here shortly, but just know that you can do granular restores as well as doing a lot of searching and moving it back to the original inbox or even to another organization. Next slide. So you can see here that the goal with US Signal and Acronis is to actually help close all these protection gaps that Nick was talking about earlier. There are other items that we do, but we're focused more on this with 365 and email security. Of course, backing up, we've been doing it since 2003. Again, the granular recovery, you're going to get ransomware protection, got a lot of data centers. We partner with US Signal with their data center, but you'll see that there's a lot of areas that we actually close the protection gaps with you. And the next slide will start to explain with Microsoft 365 all the areas that we can protect with you. US Signal has their data center as well, and then there's a cloud-to-cloud backup type situation here. So when it comes to pricing or exactly how it works, I mean, you can always get in touch with US Signal on that. But you could see here that for all the different areas within 365, what we do back up and what we can recover. Next slide. The one thing that is not in the regular core package is we have a product that's called the Advanced Backup, and that helps you with group management with 365. So if you have Azure Active Directory groups out there, you can create dynamic groups, right, that you're setting up in Microsoft's Admin Center. When they're added or removed from groups, they're automatically synced once a day with our product. You could do different filtering options with that to allow for different group backups. So if you said, I want to just do the salespeople in the East Coast office in New Jersey, you can create that as a dynamic group. Someone leaves, they're not in that group anymore. Someone's added, they're automatically in there, and that helps you with not missing people as far as doing your backups with them. Next slide. So just with the advanced backup with this, you could see here that with the group backups, you could do everything from teams to users groups, public folders, as well as site collections. So that's something that if you got a larger, more diverse organization and people are moving, adding, dropping, this is something you need to really look at, and you can speak to US Signal about that. Next slide. On this slide and the next, what we're going to be talking about is the cloud-to-cloud backup piece. And that was what US Signal has partnered with us on. And you'll see various reasons for this. For example, if we were just using the agent-based here, you would only be getting Exchange Online. So it fit so that we could do all the different areas in there, including OneNote as well. So just know that it's more of a cloud-to-cloud backup. Next slide. Key part on this one I'd like to see is if you're protecting more than one 365 organization or you need to recover to an organization, then you can do that as well. I know someone in the Q&A asked, will this be available, this slide deck? If so, Katie, what I can do is I can make this into a PDF so it's smaller in size so we can send that out to people. So, it's a nice little cheat sheet for you to understand what US Signal is doing as far as partnering with us on this. Next slide. From an Exchange perspective, you're going to hear me say it all the time. Granular point time recovery, right? You can search for emails. You can recover to PSD files. You can send the email from a backup, download file attachments, right? So again, you're going to get these slide decks so you get a better idea. Next slide. OneDrive. Interesting. I'm going to talk about it again. Granular point in time recovery, because you're going to find out that, OneDrive 365 doesn't exactly work that well. Again, sharing permissions recovery is also part of that, and you'll get the slide deck. Next slide. With SharePoint, you'll see I sound like a broken record here. Granular point in time and recovery, right? You can search for the items, right? And also the sharing permissions with that. And Teams, the next slide, you can see that, you can do channels, the files, the meetings, the teams, on-sites. Again, granular point in time and recovery for a lot of this. And you can actually do name searches and text searching to find what you want to do. Again, very granular in the approach. Next slide. Here, you have the main pack, right, for the backup. Now, if you're doing anything with clusters or anything like that, and you want to do backup, you're going to have the advanced backup that you see there on the far right. My suggestion is, if you look at it, we've been talking about backing up and then security, but, email. If you can reduce phishing attacks by 90% of the ransomware that's coming into the organization by increasing your your email security, we have a solution for that. So please talk to US Signal about that. I'm a big proponent of, if you can reduce a lot of the attack vector coming into the organization, they can help you with that. And again, the group backup was up there, as well as if you're doing Exchange clusters, is in the advanced backup. But you'll see in the main pack what we can do for you as far as protecting you with US Signal. So I wanted to give a little bit of final thoughts here on some things. Again, accidental deletion is a very common reason. And I would say that ransomware kind of might be taking that honor. But, once you go past that retention policies, the data's gone. So you really need to seriously think about, if you needed to get things from 4 months ago or 7 months ago, some sales rep left 6 months ago, but they didn't decide to put stuff into the CRM system, and all they did was keep the emails intact. And 6 months ago, you have a new rep taking over, and they're like, I have no idea what's going on with that company. Really bad thing. We talked about the ransomware earlier. I'm not going to go into that. But the granular restore thing. A lot of people realize that, OneDrive, it's a one point in time. But again, if granular restore is going to be important, which I think everybody on this call, it is important. That is something that is a definite benefit to you to look into as far as partnering with US Signal with this. Next slide. I want to remind people that I've gotten people to say that OneDrive is my backup. Now, it's a file syncing tool, right? A lot of times, people have it where if you put something on your local drive and it's infected, right, it propagates to the OneDrive account. So it's not, some people, yeah, that's my backup. It's not really truly a backup. And if it was, I think Microsoft would be pitching that to you, that this is a backup solution, as opposed to Section 6B saying, please use another third-party solution for backup. And then, of course, file versions by themselves and isolated recovery points. Where I wanted to get, I know we're kind of running out of time here, and I wanted to make sure we have some time for Q&A. The next slide we have with US Signal, they have resources that we partnered with them on about. It goes more into detail about some 6 data protection gaps and how you can close them with partnering with US Signal, as well as how to prevent a lot of different types of cyber attacks within the 365 environment. So I behooves of you to, when you get this PowerPoint, to look those up. Maybe, when they send this out to you, they can give you those links. But I would really recommend that you look at those. And with that, I wanted to leave time for Q&A. Like I said, I know one person put in there about, will the slides be available? I'll make that PDF and I'll send it out to Katie, and we'll go ahead and get that out to you. Ooh.
All right, go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will go ahead and spend the next few minutes answering those.
So is that first person being scared to kind
I
of get
know.
on there? So I guess my question would be is, how do we find out more information, right? Obviously contact US Signal on this, and they can actually help with partnering with us. If we have to have our engineers assist with anything, getting more deep dive, we're here to support them. But definitely reach out to them with that.
Yes, contact information is on the screen. As Steve mentioned, we will get everybody a copy of today's PowerPoint along with those resources that were highlighted in the slides. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.